Berlin, 1943. The city no longer looked like a capital of an empire. It looked like a graveyard made of stone. Buildings were torn open like broken ribs. Smoke hung permanently in the air. Sirens had become more common than church bells. And in the middle of this ruined city walked a man who no longer knew who he was. His name was Karl Fischer. At least, that was the name written on the papers in his pocket. But even Karl himself was no longer sure if that name still belonged to him. He was not a soldier. He was not a hero. He was not a fighter. He was just a clerk before the war. A man who worked in an office, stamped documents, returned home every evening to his wife and son. A normal man. But WWII did not allow normal men to exist. The morning that changed everything. The morning began with explosions, not far ones. Close, too close. Karl was eating a piece of dry bread when the first bomb hit 3 streets away. The windows shattered inward. Dust filled the room. His son began screaming. By the time Karl ran outside, the street no longer existed. Fire everywhere. People bleeding. Horses screaming. Buildings collapsing like dying giants. And then he saw it. 2 soldiers dragging a group of civilians toward trucks. A loudspeaker shouted, "All able-bodied men will be checked for service." Karl froze. He was 34 years old. Healthy. That meant one thing. The front. Almost certain death. He turned back toward his building. But it was already burning. There was nowhere left to run. The uniforms of the dead. As Karl stumbled through a side street, he saw bodies near a collapsed wall. 3 German soldiers, dead. Their helmets still on. Their coats still buttoned. Karl stared at them. Not with horror, but with calculation. An unthinkable thought entered his mind. A dangerous thought. A thought that would erase his old life forever. If he looked like a soldier, no one would question him. No draft officer. No patrol. No checkpoints. Civilians were hunted. Soldiers were ignored. His hands shook. He knelt beside a corpse. The soldier's face was pale. Eyes empty. Karl whispered, "Forgive me." He removed the uniform. The birth of a ghost. In a ruined hallway, Karl changed clothes. Civilian coat off. Military coat on. He stared at himself in broken glass. He no longer looked like a clerk. He looked like a man who belonged to the war. In that moment, Karl Fischer died. And someone else was born. A man without a real name. A man without a side. A man who would survive by becoming invisible. Not by fighting, but by blending in. As he stepped back onto the street, soldiers passed him without a second glance. For the first time that day, Karl was safe. And that terrified him more than the bombs, because he understood something terrible. To survive this war, he would have to stop being himself. Karl Fischer walked among soldiers, yet he was not one of them. Boots struck broken stone in perfect rhythm. Left, right, left, right. The sound echoed through the shattered streets of Berlin like the heartbeat of a dying city. Karl forced himself to match their pace, not too fast, not too slow, because in wartime Germany, walking incorrectly could get you killed. The first test. A checkpoint appeared ahead. 2 SS men stood beside sandbags, checking papers. Karl felt his throat dry. He had stolen a uniform, but he had not stolen a past. The man in front of him handed over documents. Stamped, passed. Another soldier. Checked. Passed. Now it was Karl's turn. The officer studied him. "You, unit?" Karl's mind went blank. A second too long. The officer's eyes narrowed. Karl remembered something he had heard hundreds of times on the radio. "Infantry Replacement Battalion, sir." The words felt foreign in his mouth. The officer stared at him for 3 endless seconds. Then stamped the paper. "Move." Karl walked forward. Only when the checkpoint disappeared behind him did he realize he had been holding his breath. He had survived, not by strength, but by pretending, studying the living. From that day on, Karl became a student of human behavior. He watched soldiers carefully, how they stood, how they smoked, how they spoke. He memorized their jokes, their slang, their complaints. At night, he practiced whispering. Front line is hell. Rations are worse every week. The war is lost, but don't say it out loud. He learned when to speak, and when silence was safer. He learned that confident ignorance was better than nervous knowledge. He learned that in war, identity was armor. A close call. One evening, in a crowded shelter, a real soldier sat beside him. "Where are you from?" Karl froze again. If he answered wrong, everything would collapse. "Hamburg," Karl said quietly, the first city that came to mind. The soldier nodded. "My brother died there last year in the bombing." Karl lowered his head respectfully. Inside, guilt twisted his stomach. He was stealing not just a uniform, but a place among the dead. The new rules of survival. That night, Karl wrote invisible rules in his mind. Never stand out. Never correct anyone. Never show fear. Never ask questions. And most important, never let anyone know who you were before the war. Because Karl Fischer, the clerk, could not survive this world. Only the shadow in uniform could. The death of a past life. Weeks passed. Karl stopped thinking like a civilian. He stopped imagining his old office. Stopped imagining his old home. That man belonged to another world. A world that no longer existed. Berlin had taught him a brutal truth. In war, identity is more dangerous than weapons. And to live, you must disappear inside the crowd. Karl thought blending in would keep him safe. He was wrong, because one morning the war finally noticed him. The order that changed everything. At dawn, loudspeakers echoed through the streets. All available units prepare for transport east. East. Every German knew what that meant. The Eastern Front was not a battlefield. It was a slaughterhouse. Karl stood among soldiers as an officer read out names, and then he heard it. Fischer, Karl. His heart stopped. The name he had stolen had found him. He raised his hand slowly. In that moment, he understood the cruel joke of fate. He had hidden in a uniform to avoid war. Now the uniform was dragging him straight into it. Inside the transport train. The train was not meant for people. It was meant for cattle. Wooden wagons. No seats, no heat. Men were packed together like cargo. The doors slammed shut. Darkness swallowed them. The train began to move. Someone whispered, "They say hardly anyone comes back from where we're going." Karl closed his eyes. He was no longer hiding in plain sight. He was being carried toward death, learning the soldier's mind. Inside the wagon, men spoke freely. They believed Karl was one of them. They talked about frozen corpses, starving villages, encircled divisions erased from maps. Karl listened in silence. Every story confirmed what he already feared. If he reached the front, his lie would end. A civilian could not survive real combat. The night escape plan. As the train slowed near a forest, Karl noticed something. The door latch was loose. The guards were drunk. The night was thick with fog. An idea formed. A desperate, insane idea. Better to die running than die wearing another man's name, he whispered to himself. Now or never. Jumping into darkness. When the train slowed on a curve, Karl moved. He pulled the latch. The door slid open slightly. Cold air rushed in. Men stared at him in shock. "Are you mad?" Karl didn't answer. He jumped. The world became spinning darkness. Branches tore his face. The ground slammed into him. Pain exploded through his body. But the train continued without him. Karl lay motionless in the forest. Blood on his lips, alive by accident. A man without a side. He had escaped the front, but now he was something worse. A deserter. If caught, he would be shot. He had no papers, no home, no identity. He was no longer a civilian. No longer a soldier. He was a ghost walking between worlds. And ghosts have no protection, only hiding. Karl Fischer woke up in silence. No bombs, no engines, no shouting, only wind moving through broken trees. For the first time in years, the war was not screaming, and that terrified him more than noise ever had. Between two deaths, Karl lay in a ruined farmhouse on the edge of a forgotten village. His ribs burned, his ankle was swollen. Jumping from the train had saved his life, but broken his body. He was now hunted by both sides. If the Germans found him, he was a deserter. If the Allies found him, he was an enemy soldier. The uniform that once protected him had become a death sentence. The mirror of fear. In a cracked mirror hanging on a wall, Karl saw himself. Unshaven, sunken eyes, torn field jacket. He no longer looked like a civilian. He no longer looked like a real soldier. He looked suspicious. In war, suspicion is enough to die. The farmer's choice. That evening, footsteps approached. Karl reached for a broken bottle. A farmer entered. Old, thin, terrified. They stared at each other. Two men trapped by the same war. Karl spoke first. "I won't hurt you." The farmer hesitated, then whispered, "My son is dead at Stalingrad." Silence fell between them. The farmer could turn Karl in, or hide him. Finally, he said, "War has taken enough from me." He handed Karl bread. That act of mercy saved Karl's life, living like a shadow. For weeks, Karl stayed hidden. He worked at night. He slept in cellars. He spoke to no one. He learned the new truth of survival. Not fighting, not running, but becoming forgettable, erasing himself. Karl removed insignia. He dirtied his uniform. He walked like a tired laborer. He stopped making eye contact. He trained himself to look unimportant, invisible. He was no longer hiding in plain sight. He was hiding inside emptiness. The price of survival. Each day he survived. Something inside him died. Memories faded. His old voice disappeared. He no longer thought of himself as Karl Fischer. He thought of himself as someone who must not be noticed, because in this world, only the invisible remain alive. Karl Fischer had survived bombs, trains, and forests. But the most dangerous place in war was not the battlefield. It was a town full of people, because people look. And in wartime, being seen is the same as being judged. The need to move. Food was running out. The farmer who hit him could barely feed himself. Karl understood the danger. Staying meant starvation. Moving meant exposure. But survival demanded motion. So Karl made a decision that terrified him more than jumping from the train. He would walk through a controlled town in daylight. The town of eyes. The town looked calm from a distance. Church still standing. Shops half open. Children silent. But beneath the surface, fear ruled everything. Posters on walls. Report deserters. Report spies. Report suspicious behavior. Karl realized something horrifying. Everyone had become a guard. Paper control. At the square, soldiers stopped every man. Papers, names, units. Karl felt the weight of his empty pockets. No documents, no protection, only behavior. He remembered his rule. Confidence hides lies better than truth hides fear. He stepped forward calmly. A soldier stopped him. Papers. Karl met his eyes. "I lost them in the bombing near Dresden." The soldier studied him. Karl did not look away. Fear shows itself when you blink. Another officer waved his hand. "Too many today, move on." Karl walked away. His legs nearly collapsed. The old woman's stare. At a bakery, an old woman stared at him too long. Her eyes narrowed. She whispered to a man beside her. Karl understood. She sensed something wrong. He lowered his gaze. Bought bread. Left immediately. In war, intuition is a weapon. Learning the most important skill. Karl finally understood the deepest rule of survival. Do not look dangerous. Do not look brave. Do not look smart. Look ordinary. Mediocrity was armor, a public execution. That afternoon, the town gathered in silence. A young man stood against a wall, accused of desertion. No trial, no defense, a single shot. The body fell. Karl did not move. Inside, he was screaming. That man was him. Only luck separated them. The final lesson of the town. As Karl left the square, he realized the war no longer needed bombs. People themselves had become weapons. Eyes were now more deadly than guns. And he swore, never be noticed again, because the moment people remember your face, you disappear forever. Karl Fischer understood a terrible truth. As long as he wore the uniform, he belonged to the war, and the war would never let him go. The uniform had once saved him. Now it would destroy him. The weight of cloth. Every step in military boots sounded loud. Every button marked him. Every stitch connected him to armies, orders, and death. He was no longer hiding in plain sight. He was marked, and marked men are eventually found. Karl realized something chilling. To survive, he had to disappear completely, not just from records, but from memory. The night decision. In a forest far from towns, Karl stopped. He removed the jacket, then the boots, then the trousers. He stared at the uniform lying on the ground. It was not cloth anymore. It was a past life, a stolen life, a dangerous life. If caught wearing it, execution. If caught without it, maybe prison, maybe survival. For the first time, he chose uncertainty over certainty. Burning the evidence. Karl built a small fire. He hesitated. This uniform had kept him alive. Destroying it felt like killing the man he had become. Then he remembered the executed deserter. He threw the jacket into the flames. The fire swallowed the eagle insignia. Buttons melted. Fabric curled and vanished. His false identity burned away, becoming no one. Now Karl was nothing. No soldier, no civilian, just a man in rags. He felt naked before the world, but also lighter. For the first time in years, he did not belong to any army. He belonged only to survival, learning a new invisibility. Without a uniform, he had to change again. He learned to walk like a refugee, to hunch his shoulders, to appear broken. War ignores the broken. Strong men are used. Weak men are overlooked. So Karl learned to look defeated. The psychological death. As the fire died, Karl whispered, "Karl Fischer is gone. No name, no papers, no past." He became a moving shadow, and shadows are not questioned. The new rule. He carved a final rule into his mind. If no one can define you, no one can destroy you. By 1944, Germany was no longer a nation. It was a river of people running in every direction. Families without homes, soldiers without units, children without parents. And Karl finally understood. The perfect place to disappear is where no one can be counted. Entering the human flood, Karl joined a refugee column moving west. Thousands walked together. No one asked names. No one asked origins. Everyone had lost something. In this river of misery, identity had no value. It was the first place since the war began where Karl felt safe. The new currency, stories. Refugee camps were full of lies. Men became farmers. Farmers became mechanics. Mechanics became widowers. Truth had become dangerous. Karl learned quickly. He told one simple story everywhere. "My home is gone. It was always true. No details. Details kill." Disappearing in noise. Children cried. Wagons broke. Old people collapsed. Guards were overwhelmed. In chaos, control weakens. Karl walked unnoticed through checkpoints hidden inside crowds. His invisibility had evolved. He was no longer hiding alone. He was hiding inside humanity itself, a stolen identity. One night in a camp, Karl overheard a dying man whisper his name to a nurse. No family, no papers. Dead by morning. Karl memorized the name. In war, names were floating objects. Unused names meant survival. By dawn, Karl had a new identity. Not stolen from the living, borrowed from the dead. The moral collapse. Before the war, Karl would have been horrified. Now he felt nothing. War had rewritten his conscience. Survival had replaced morality. He was no longer choosing between right and wrong, only between alive and dead. The skill of forgetting. Karl began forgetting his real past. Faces faded, voices blurred. He was becoming what the war required. A man without memory, a man without weight. The final understanding. In the refugee river, Karl learned the deepest truth of wartime survival. Armies are visible, cities are visible, but masses are invisible, and only the invisible pass through history untouched. By early 1945, the war was gasping its last. Bombs still fell, but the lines were collapsing. The front no longer mattered. Karl Fischer, the man who had erased himself from uniforms, from towns, from names, now faced the ultimate test, surviving when everyone else was desperate to reclaim life. The ghosts in the rubble. Karl walked through a town destroyed beyond recognition. Walls had collapsed. Smoke filled the air. A child's doll lay in the mud, scorched. Men and women moved like ghosts, searching for scraps, for bread, for any piece of normalcy. Every step was danger. Every movement could reveal him. Because now, not just armies, but civilians had begun hunting those who might be spies, deserters or looters. Suspicion had become the new law. Trading in shadows. Karl had learned to barter in invisibility. A loaf of bread here, a coat there, a lie here, a nod there. No one asked questions. No one remembered faces. Survival had become not about courage, not about strength, but about cunning. And Karl had become a master. The sudden threat. While passing a crumbled marketplace, two men approached, shouting accusations. "Who are you? Where are your papers?" Karl froze, his heart hammering. He recalled every lesson. Low posture, slow movements, averting eyes. He muttered a name he had borrowed 2 weeks ago. The men stared, unsure. Then, with a shrug, they moved on. A victory in survival is often silent. The human tide. That afternoon, Karl merged into a crowd leaving the city. Thousands moving west. Every man, woman, and child carrying both belongings and despair. Karl realized, in this mass of suffering, he could finally hide in plain sight. But hiding had a cost. His own identity had disappeared. His family, gone. His friends, gone. Even his own face. He barely recognized it in the reflection of a puddle. A lesson in patience. Survival was no longer about running from bombs or bullets. It was about patience, moving with the tide of humanity, waiting for the war to exhaust itself. Karl understood that patience could be deadly, and yet it was the only thing keeping him alive. The burning reminder. As night fell, Karl found a small fire. He sat beside it, staring at the ashes of a burned village sign. The war had destroyed everything, and yet life stubbornly continued. He whispered to himself, "Perhaps the war is ending, but survival never ends." The war was over, but Karl Fischer did not feel victory. Around him, cities were silent, broken, and smoking. Survivors emerged like cautious shadows from hiding places. Some cried, some hugged strangers, some simply walked, dazed. Karl had survived bombs, bullets, and betrayal, but now he faced a new enemy. Choice. The crossroads. Before him lay 2 roads. One led to a refugee camp, crowded, regulated, and under Allied control. Food, safety, perhaps even a chance at rebuilding a life. But visibility came with it. Names had to be spoken. identity reclaimed. The other path was through the wild outskirts. Forests, abandoned villages, rivers, freedom, yes, but isolation, no support, no shelter, a life of continuous running and hiding. Karl paused. The wind carried smoke and ashes from the city. He realized survival had always been about making impossible choices, the weight of living. For years, Karl had become invisible. No one knew him. No one remembered his face, and that invisibility had saved him. But to live now meant risking it. To rebuild, he had to be seen. To be seen meant vulnerability. Every instinct told him, keep moving, keep hiding, keep being nothing. But his heart whispered, you cannot survive forever like this. At some point, life must be lived, not avoided. The first step. Karl chose the camp. He approached cautiously. Every step was measured, careful, controlled. The soldiers at the gate questioned him. His papers were fake, his story convincing. And for the first time in years, Karl felt relief, a sense of normalcy, thin and fragile, but tangible. Faces among the living. Inside the camp, he saw people he had never imagined meeting. Children laughing, though weak and starving. Old men telling stories about the pre-war world. Women cooking over small fires, sharing bread. Karl felt something he had not in a long time. Hope, but it came with fear. Hope made one visible. Hope could be destroyed. The silent resolve. That night, Karl sat alone. He touched the papers in his pocket. The uniform burned. His past was gone. The road ahead uncertain. He whispered, I survived the war. Now I must survive myself. And for the first time, survival was no longer just hiding. It was learning to live again. The war had ended. Karl Fischer stepped into a world that had survived, even thrived, without him. Ruined towns were being rebuilt. Fields were planted again. Children ran freely, unaware of the horrors that had preceded them. For Karl, the world was both familiar and alien. Every face he saw was a reminder. Life continued, even for those who had been lost, reclaiming identity. At the refugee camp, Karl no longer hid. He spoke his name slowly, carefully. He handed over the forged papers, replaced them with his new, true identity. It was terrifying. The world now knew him, but he was alive. Alive with a chance to be more than a shadow. Memories and ghosts. At night, memories haunted him. The uniform burned in the forest. The faces in the refugee crowd. The people he could not save. Survivor's guilt weighed heavily. But for the first time, Karl did not run from it. He carried it like a medal, a reminder that he had endured what few could survive. Rebuilding the human, Karl found work in a small village. He helped repair homes, rebuild fences, and restore broken farms. People accepted him cautiously, some curious, others wary. He never spoke of the war. Not yet, not until he was ready. But inside him, a quiet strength had grown, a knowledge that life is fragile, and that survival is not just avoiding death, but learning to live in the aftermath. The final dawn. One morning, Karl climbed a small hill near the village. Sunlight broke through the mist. He could see the valley stretching endlessly, farms, rivers, and tiny houses. He stood silently, absorbing the calm. For the first time in years, he breathed without fear. And he whispered to himself, I survived the shadows. Now I will live. Closing thoughts. War had stolen names, families, homes, and innocence. But it could not take life itself. Karl had learned the ultimate lesson. Survival is an art of patience, silence, and courage. And beyond the shadows, life waits for those brave enough to reclaim it.